Well, thank you for that introduction, Melissa, and I'm glad to be here, and thank you for being here and listening to this presentation. Ken's giving you a great story about what the situation with the orcas is, and I'm the hope piece here in terms of, I want to try to show you that there's a solution to saving salmon, fish, Chinook, and saving these orcas, and saving equally at the same time a bunch of your money, tax money and rate money. And so that's what my presentation will focus on. I'll try to do it quickly so we can get to some questions. But first off, let's start a little bit about vision. Obviously, we want to work on the orcas, and also on the left side actually is a vision rendering for the macaw tribe that was done about 10 years ago. And you can see that what we're missing here is this abundance of seafood and the quality of life that the ocean can offer. And so that's part of the solution too, is working on that vision to restore, livelihood for all people. Quickly, the 4 state dams are in eastern Washington. This is what they look like. Each of the dams is basically a hydropower dam and a navigation dam. They are not flood control. And so, of course, we have Chinook salmon is what we're primarily concerned with, because that's the primary source for food. And I should say that the reason we're talking about Snake River dams in terms of Chinook is that because that's historically where most of the Chinook came out of the Columbia Basin, and especially today because most of the Columbia is blocked off completely, whereas the Snake River has still got some very good tributaries up in Idaho. But they're impacted by these dams. And so this is where the dams are in eastern Washington. Whoops, wrong button, sorry about that. It's like a machine gun. Okay, so this button, yeah. So they're in eastern Washington, and part of the problem is they're in eastern Washington, we're over here, so why are we talking about dams in eastern Washington? Again, we have to remember this is a massive ecosystem, from the headwaters up here in the mountains in Idaho, down the Snake to the Columbia, along our coastal waters, and all the way up to the Aleutians. And so this is a primary food source that should exist for these orcas, these resident orcas, but it's been severely impaired. So a long time ago, when I was working for the Corps, well, about 15 years ago, in Walla Walla, I was a deputy district engineer there. And Walla Walla is where those dams are located. So I was in charge of operating, I was a deputy, 700 people. And because of some court cases in the early 90s, the Corps was required to develop a study that cost a lot of money. And it basically turned into an environmental impact statement and a record of decision in 2002. And so basically, I just want to note about the Corps of Engineers built these dams, and what does the Corps say? I mean, what did we say in that EIS, basically? Well, the statement, basically that was a $33 million study, took a long time. There were 4 alternatives that were studied. They were do nothing, maximum transport, that's putting fish in a barge, taking them downriver and dumping them below the last dam. Major systems improvements is a fancy word for hanging gear on a dam to get juveniles over the dam, because the turbines and all this stuff were allegedly killing, and they do a lot of salmon. And the 4th thing, of course, was dam breaching. All 4 of those alternatives were thoroughly studied. And basically what the EIS says is that, I'll just read the bottom there with bold, is that further improvements in the hydro system passage system are unlikely to recover listed Snake River stocks. So that's what our report said. But that's not what we did. And the sad part is, instead, we tried to spend a bunch of money on improving spillway passage. That's getting, water over the spillway that's a little bit safer for fish. We looked at additional fishing, additional fish barges. We added that in, and we improved, the fish ladders that were there already. And the most expensive thing is we worked on this juvenile bypass system, and that's getting the little smolts over each dam. That was the decision to do that, and it was basically because the economics at the time appeared say that, gee, if you breach these dams, it's going to create economic havoc in eastern Washington. Well, not quite. But anyway, I'll come back to that. This is what Judge Michael Simon said 2 years ago this month, is that in spite of all the billions of dollars that have been spent on these efforts, on these dams, just on these dams, listed species continue to be in a perilous state. So, you know, we got a judge saying what the Corps of Engineers are saying, but we still are, those dams are still sitting there. Well, on this chart, what I want to try to show you is that two things. One is we've got, and over here, we've got this lineup right here, which shows salmon counts over the years from 2002. And so this is when we made this decision to invest in something that was actually worse than doing nothing. And so what happened? We started spending money, and basically what happened is the salmon numbers declined. This curve up here is the amount, the cumulative amount of money we were spending each year. And so there's the trend line for the money right there. So tell me, folks, you think that was a good investment of your tax money? Oh, $1 billion or $1.5 billion by this time, and this is what you got for it. A worse situation. So that's the sad fact about that decision, and it's just we'll come back. But anyway, it was about $1 billion just since 2002, and a total of $1.5 billion. That's real money. That money had a significant impact because it was deprived from this part of the state in terms of salmon recovery efforts over here. And also, we got to keep in mind that currently our runs are less than 3% of the historic, which was between 10 and 16 billion average, and they ran as high as 30 million and fish a year. So you can see that in this chart here, the numbers of fish we're talking about, is 50,000 to 100,000 fish, when we used to have millions. And think about what Ken said. How many salmon do these fish eat? A lot. I mean, they eat all those. And what's going on right now, it looks like, is these orcas are basically eating their seed corn. The spring chinook that are out there trying to come in now is basically their lifeline, and they're probably eating up. You know, they don't have anything else to eat, so they're stuck. But unfortunately, it's a problem that can't be solved the way we're going at it now. We've also spent billions more on habitat, which has largely been wasted in the Snake River Basin, and it's been sub-optimized in the Puget Sound, Salish Sea, and on the coastal areas. And what I mean by that, with those numbers collapsing down in the Snake River, what that means is there's more pressure on these coastal stocks and the Salish Sea stocks for fishing and marine mammals and other predators. And so that all that investment in culvert removals and all that kind of stuff is really going to be sub-optimized if we don't get more fish back. And the only way to do that is get them past those dams. This is another chart that just shows how many fish returns were coming back from across Ice Harbor Dam, which is the first of the Snake River dams. And you can see, too, we just got in spite of all this money, a continuing downward trend. This chart is from a government document, and what it shows is a really important metric, and it's called the smolt to adult survival ratio. And what scientists tell us is if you don't have a smolt to adult survival ratio above 2%, recovery is impossible. And the goal is really 4%, and between 4 and 6% is the target the government has put on their recovery efforts. But you can see that we're not only below 2, we're below 1 on a lot of this stuff, these wild salmon stocks. So again, we've got this situation where in spite of all this money, nothing's happening. This is hatchery fish, which people depend, say, oh, we can always crank out hatchery fish. They're even in worse shape. They have an even less survival rate. So none of this is good news for what's going on. That was last year. What's going on today out there? These charts are produced every day. They're on a website, and And what they're showing is that Chinook adults over Bonneville Dam, which is the lowest on the Columbia River, this dark line is a 10-year average. So that's what we should be hitting. This is what we've gotten so far this year. And what's really troubling is Lower Granite Dam down here. This is the upper of the Snake River dams. We've gotten almost nothing. And this is crucial because that little bit of salmon is the ones that are supposed to go to Idaho where all this habitat is. It's so good. And there's very few making it back. In fact, it's so bad that the pristine waters and the headwaters of Idaho are devoid of biological activity because the food web has collapsed. Why? Not enough salmon come back, they die, and they're the basic elements in the food web. And so with so few fish coming back, this habitat is basically becoming sterile. So, what next? And I didn't want to put disaster on the chart because, oh my God, it sounds like I'm hyperbole. But that's actually a quote from a National Marine Fisheries scientist last year when they checked ocean conditions and did trawls out there, and they found almost no fish out there. In other words, the numbers were so low in the trawl, they were calling it a disaster. So I'm going to skip through some of these numbers here. Then I want to talk about Bonneville Power. And the reason we need to talk about this is the money, another money piece. We said, well, the Corps of Engineers is wasting money. Well, Bonneville Power, because of this 92%, this is the 4 Lower Snake River dams. Bonneville Power has to repay 92% of that billions of dollars invested in these dams. You guys know what's going on with Bonneville Power these days? Haven't seen it in the newspaper probably, but here's the situation. This is Elliot Meinzer. He is the administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration. He's the man responsible for entrusting your tax money and your ratepayer money to make sure we're getting a good deal. So I want to see if I can get him to talk for us.
I would say, to be really frank, if there's an axis of sort of nonchalance to panic, I think it's important that we don't get into a panic mode. I'm not in a panic mode, but I'm in a very, very significant sense of urgency mode, and I do think that the risks facing Bonneville are real. And I feel that even though we've got 10 years left in our long-term contracts until 2028, that the time for action, and I think real action, is now.
Yeah. So, here your administrator is this close to declaring panic. I don't know about you, but this reminds me of Enron, if you remember those days. And he used to work for Enron. And so we got a situation on our hands here, and they need solutions fast. And there is one common solution that will help take care of this financial crisis and also save salmon and orcas. But a little bit more about Bonneville's situation is the fact that this is from their strategic report. It came out a few months ago, and the problem is this is what Bonneville charges you as ratepayers. Okay, out here it's like $30-something. Well, in 2018, where we are, it's about $36 a megawatt hour. Problem is, this is the price of power on the open market. And so as ratepayers from Bonneville Power, you got to ask yourself, how come we have to pay this when if you go to another source beside Bonneville Power, you can get your power for this price? This is a massive dilemma for Bonneville because they're losing customers because of this. They cannot meet the cost. And there's a huge price difference between, what the open market price is and so forth. So, and I just basically said that the price is going. This chart is another Bonneville Power chart, and it shows the amount of power being produced. And the red line is the demand of customers like you. The blue line is the amount of hydropower being produced by the Corps of Engineers Bureau of Reclamation dams. And you can see it's up here. So there's a lot more hydropower than demand. And down here's wind and the nuclear and some fossil stuff down here at the very bottom, which is almost disappearing these days. This gray line is the amount of power that's basically surplus to BPA. Now, it used to be that BPA could make money off surplus power, but not anymore. California's got so much solar, there's so much wind in the system, and so a lot of this power, that's why that curve is going down, is being sold really dirt cheap. This is another chart that basically shows, this is the lower Snake River dams in terms of their production, and you can see what we're showing here is the wind is far surpassed the amount of capacity coming out of the Snake River dams. So the point we're trying to make here, and that Ken was making with that chart, is that we've got 4 dams that are, their output is virtually all surplus being sold at below market prices, and it's costing Bonneville a lot of money. So let me skip through here. They're cutting back on habitat work. Wind energy, Bonneville's had to curtail it 40 times last year because they had too much, it was burning up the grid. BPA has nearly 0 days of cash reserve. Now think about this, a major utility with no cash reserves. It went down $600 million in the last 7 or 8 years. Customers are bailing out. And this is the point that Ken made, 93,000 hours, and only 2 used. And here's the economic situation that the Corps has to look at. What is the value of these dams to you taxpayers? And the problem, and here's the startling reality. These dams, these 4 dams, are only bringing in 15 cents on the dollar. So every tax dollar or ratepayer dollar you put in these dams, you get 15 cents back. That is horrible economic benefits, and that's why the Corps of Engineers ought to be doing something about these dams. For the last few years, we know that annual expenditures have been exceeding earnings. ALSRD dams are at least 2, maybe 3 times more expensive than the big Columbia dams. We need those Columbia dams. You know, this is not about knocking all the dams down. We need to get rid of the poor performing assets and put the money on these other dams that are doing a decent job. I'll skip about turbine rehabs and all this kind of stuff, but basically Bonneville cannot afford to replace the turbines that are worn out on these dams. And then the oversupply power is increasing due to conservation, wind and solar. But there is a fast way out. And basically, you can save salmon, save money, save more at the same time in 2018. And the point here is that when you liquidate or basically put into a non-operational status these dams, it saves all this money. So here's the quick on the economics. The good side of it is the corrected breach cost. These dams don't cost $2 or $3 billion like you've been hearing to breach. It's about 340. The benefit to cost ratio after you breach is 4 to 1 if you were to replace the hydropower. But like we said, you got surplus hydropower. You don't need to do that. And we've got solar piling up in BPA's waiting list to get on the grid. The other key thing for us over here in the Salish Sea area is all that money being pumped into those dams could have come over here and funded the Puget Sound Nearshore Restoration Program, but the Corps can't afford to do that. Breaching is going to add thousands of jobs, mostly in eastern Washington, but there's Orca tourism jobs that are at stake here in this part of the state. And you can also earn some money for our state school budgets, because once those dams breach, that land then can be leased by the state for agricultural purposes, and that generates money for schools. And the habitat investments I said we were making earlier that are being sub-optimized, well, that will get fixed. Breaching opens up roughly 80 miles of Chinook spawning habitat, which is crucial. This was their Chinook or main stem spawners. This is critical habitat for them. I've already talked about moving money from mitigation funding to better opportunities like riparian restoration. And the other thing, of course, is we relieve that fishing prey and prey pressure on Salish Sea and coastal stocks. So this is another reason why these dams are important to us, because they're affecting our fishing. And of course, it produces more fish for the southern residents. And we also have this problem with something called incidental take, when the Snake River stocks get so low because they're on the endangered species list. That restricts all fishing because you can't accidentally take these things. And then we get larger fish is another economic benefit. And then the whole ecosystem effect, greater numbers of larger salmon, affects the nutrients moving upstream. Other species are affected. And then you've got better riparian work, and also these reservoirs produce methane. And if you understand global warming, methane is 85% more potent, or 85 times more potent than carbon. So a small methane emission equals a big carbon footprint. But they don't want to tell you that. But it can be done. Can we do it? Yes. It takes a pile of paper. It's all policy paper. That isn't litigation. That's not suing somebody. And a couple of bulldozers is all it takes to get you to this. And so what it is, it's just a matter of, this is where the earthen berm was. You basically take those bulldozers, you knock a notch in there, you let the water wash the rest of the dam away. Really easily done. And by the way, this image is in the Corps of Engineering study, which some people have said officially to politicians that this was never studied. This is never studied. Well, it has been. And the Corps did an excellent job of actually showing how it can be done. So 4 quick points of 5 is the core key myth buster here is you can breach, the Corps can get rid of these dams without any need for congressional authorization. They have a responsibility to do that without that need. BPA pays for this stuff, so there's a way that they can actually pay for it under the mitigation rules, which means it comes off old debt, which means it doesn't come back to the ratepayers to pay for breaching. We've got a NEPA document, that's the 2002 EIS, and it has breaching in it. And I've already mentioned about the earthen berm, it's easy to do. And another point that people have been told is this litigation prevents the Corps or BPA from doing anything. That is not true. They have a responsibility to act now. And they need to start in 2018. That's a biological imperative. That's not just an arm-waving number. That is based on the biology that's represented in these government documents. We're going to do a call to action next week that's in your brochure there. If you want to take part, help us out. Make a few phone calls to some of the folks that are listed on that document. Or you can write a postcard and, leave that with one of our volunteers here to, say something. And also it's important that, it's interesting because you can solve 2 or 3 problems at one time by breaching these dams. But if you talk to your local PUDs and say, where is this, why are you letting our rates go up and up and up, and yet you've got this asset that's losing money? And that's the kind of pressure you need to put on your local PUDs, because that's how we're going to probably a good way to make a difference with vulnerable power. I'm going to close with this before we start asking questions. Just a little. This is a piece of music that was developed by a volunteer musician, a guy named Bruce Coughlin, and he wrote this a year or so ago for us, and I'll play it right now, and then we'll do questions.
Snake River runs more than 1,000 miles along to the Umatilla Nation. There's Pierce and the Yakima. For our written history, they worshipped on the banks. Salmon was the sacrament for which they all gave thanks, but the river ran free. When the Dominican signed his name, he knew he'd been betrayed. He bit his lip till the blood ran down the ground, his better rage. He stood so tall and fought so well at the end of the day. He ceded all their sacred land, all the bodies of the slain, let the river run free. Let the river run free. Came cold that paranoia, came the Corps of Engineers. Came steel, stone, and concrete of the Slackwater profiteers. clear. They chopped out a living river where the salmon used to rear. Let the river run free. Seems no matter where you turn, things go from bad to worse. You can speak the truth of consequence, but the lies so well rehearsed. Till the rumble of a million voices calls to you and me, and we raise our voice as one. Let the river run free. Now the seven rounds are nearly done, and the light has left the stream. Politicians or rhetoricians, they plot, spoil, and scheme. But our ecosystems falter, they point and cast the blame. They spin their propaganda while we play their waiting game. Let the river run free. Seems no matter where you turn, things go from bad to worse. You can speak of truth and consequence, the lies are well rehearsed. Still the rumble of a million voices starts with you and me, when we raise our voice as one. Let the river run free. It's time to breach the dams, let Mother Nature take a course. Heal and mighty river and revive its vital source. For the orca, for the fishermen, for the whole economy, for your children, for the future, and for all eternity. Let the river run free. Let the river run free. Let the river run free. Let the river run free.
Okay, thanks. And so, Melissa, I want to point out one thing. The little girl you saw in there, she's sitting right there.